Alright, hello everybody, welcome. This is our lecture on the market revolution, 1790s-ish to 1850s-ish. The essential question that I'd like you to write down on your sheet of paper: how did changes in production and transportation during the market revolution create links and divisions between the North, South, and the West? One thing to note for this lecture is that there will be some different slides that kind of take on more of a lecture that you'll see in a university setting, where traditionally I have slides that have just a list of bullet pointed key notes that for you to take down. We will have some of those, but we'll also have slides that just have a picture that I'll just be talking about, or I'll ask you to think about and jot down some ideas. That's typically what you're going to find in a college setting, so this is a good practice for listening to what the professor has to say and jotting down the significant points. Alright, feel free to pause this as you will, and let's so you can get all that good information, and let's go ahead and continue. Alright, so let's begin with factories. As you know, most of these factories are going to be developing in a particular region in the United States, and that region is the Northeast. We'll go back to why in just a moment, but let's first talk about some game-changing innovations that are going to really propel that region towards manufacturing. These are from Samuel Slater and Eli Whitney. Samuel Slater is going to come from England, the first country to kind of industrialize, to mechanize. And Slater is actually going to steal some blueprints for a cotton spinning machine from England and bring them over to the United States, smuggle them in. This is a classic example of, copyright things, of having technology and information and people wanting to keep them, secure and be able to make money off them. But the reality is that when new technology comes out and people like it, people are going to copy it and they're going to get their hands on it. Whether that is, a knockoff technology from an iPhone today being made in another country, or the cotton spinning machine in Samuel Slater's time. So that is going to change how we produce cotton. However, what's really going to double down our nation on growing cotton, as well as the labor used to produce it, is going to be from Eli Whitney. Up until the Revolution, slavery, although was still prevalent in the South, was beginning to decline. Many states, particularly in the North, are really questioning whether this is going to be a viable labor source. The South is beginning to import fewer slaves from Africa, and so we begin to see kind of a plateauing of the slave population importing, and in part because cotton is really labor intensive to pull out or to produce. It's really thorny in the middle, and it's very difficult to extract the cotton. So we're beginning to think of other sources for clothing material, as well as for the use of labor. And that is until Whitney develops his cotton gin. And essentially what that does is saves the hands, essentially, the bloody hands of the laborer who's trying to pull out these seeds. It does it incredibly quicker and much more productive. The other thing that Whitney is going to create is this idea of interchangeable parts, and specifically for rifles. So the problem was your gun would break, and you would be scrambling to find a part that fit your specific gun. His idea was that is nonsense. Let's have these interchangeable parts to where these machines are working off of the same parts that can be interchangeable. So one gun can be taken apart and applied to another. These are going to be game changers, not just for guns, but for really all machines. This idea to have common parts that will allow for increased production and usability of these machines. So here's the big unintended consequence. I'm sure you remember this from last year in world history. poor Eli Whitney, he has this great plan to make life better, specifically with the cotton gin to make labor easier, to help the worker out. The downside is, his unintended consequence, is for the cotton gin, slavery is going to just rise exponentially. Cotton is going to be seen as an incredibly profitable material, and we're going to double down on slaves. So instead of making life easier for laborers, life is actually going to get much worse. Interchangeable parts will make rifles more efficient, and this technology will be used during the Civil War to essentially decide whether this nation is going to be a slave-holding nation or not, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. So those two inventions really did cause a huge amount of death and destruction and carnage during the early 1800s. Poor Eli Whitney. All right, so let's get back to the Northeast. What was it about the Northeast originally that put them on a path towards markets, towards light manufacturing or trading? Really began with the geography, right? They didn't have they had a cold environment, rocky soil. They were not good for agriculture. They're going to be having deep water ports, which could make it more likely that they'll invest in trade and then manufacturing. The other thing is their water sources. They're going to have a lot of fast-flowing rivers, which before the 1840s is going to be very helpful for these early machines and mills that are running on water power. You need constant flow and a fast flowing to power these mills. However, after the steam power or the steam engine is created, after the 1840s, we're going to see that these factories and machines no longer have to be by rivers, but they will stay predominantly in this region because the infrastructure will have been created. A great example of this type of factory is the Lowell factory in Massachusetts. What's significant about this is the labor source. Predominantly, men will be working in these factories during the Market Revolution. However, textiles will be increasingly seen as a female job, and that we'll understand a little bit more why in the next couple of slides. But this is game changing. This is brand new and a new idea to take these young single women before they're getting married and have them work in this dormitory style factory where they're living on the premise and laboring, making textiles, making clothing. This model is actually going to be used around the world. It's still used today. It's kind of fascinating. If you look at the back of your t-shirt, see where your t-shirt was made. The textile industry is pretty much the first step for any country, whether it was Britain, whether it's the United States, whether it's Mexico, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's China. Any country that wants to industrialize begins with the textile industry, predominantly because it's easy and everybody needs a t-shirt at the end of the day. And so this style that Lowell came up with for women being employed is going to be used throughout the world. So we'll come back to why in just a moment. Let's move on. Let's look at this change in production. Go ahead and write down some characteristics that you see of a craftsman, but prior to the Market Revolution. What do you see here? Who are these people? How are they working? Write down some characteristics. Alrighty. So things that you might have noticed, both men and women working side by side. These individuals are working on a task, usually using some light machinery or some tools, but what you're going to find is that they're completing it from beginning to end. They're going to see this process all the way through, whether they are printing a newspaper, whether they are cobbling a shoe, whether they are cutting a piece of fabric and making clothing. one person is going to see it all the way through, which means they are skilled in what they do. They have to have a lot of knowledge about that craft. They're also working in a small workshop. They're working with other individuals who may be working on the same thing or on other different projects. It's a very individual and yet communal kind of atmosphere that requires a lot of skill and a lot of time. Go ahead and take down some characteristics of during the market revolution. The term that many who are distasteful of this form of work are going to call the wage slave. What are the characteristics that you see of a wage slave, somebody who is working during the market revolution? All right. So, as you may have noticed, most people, these wage slaves, are going to be working still probably in large numbers, but more on individualized tasks. The mining is going to be a increasing job that is going to require a lot of workers, predominantly males. They're going to be working in dark and damp and sooty conditions. It's going to be hot. The conditions are going to be very unfavorable. They're not going to have a lot of tools or resources at their disposal besides their one, pickaxe or their shovel or their cart. This is going to be a very labor-intensive job. In the factory, it's going to be very similar. You have one individual doing one part of this process. Working in large numbers to produce as much as you can. The advantage of this part is that it's going to be much more efficient. You have one person who is doing one part of a job, which means they'll do it over and over and over again. It takes less skill. They are not a part of that product from beginning to end. They're just taking one aspect of it. Let's do the same for females. Go ahead and write down some characteristics of how textiles were made in these early days prior to the market revolution. Okay, so prior to the market revolution, this was a really communal aspect where women were meeting together at somebody's home or in a small workshop and sewing clothes together. This is where they would learn this task, learn different tips and tricks for making these garments. But also it was kind of an enjoyable aspect. I mean, you can imagine they're not just sitting there in silence. They're gossiping, they're talking, they're telling stories, they're laughing, they're having fun. This is a communal aspect of this part of work. Take a moment and look at some differences after or during the market revolution for how clothing is going to be made. All right, so things that you might have jotted down for these factory girls is that it is very isolating. You are working alone on this individualized task, and you're not really seeing the larger garment being made. You are doing one part of this garment, and the machine is doing much of the rest. You are, in a sense, tending more to the machine than you are making a garment. This is isolating. Does not use as much skill as working in a sewing circle would. And yeah, this is going to be a dramatic change in labor. And people are going to respond to this quite differently, and depending on where they are in the nation. So what are the effects of this new factory system? Again, the basics are it's faster and more efficient, but it's also going to change the idea of work. Time is going to be a huge factor in this idea of work. And this seems really strange for us today because time is so much a part of our daily existence. Just think about school. Think about how much time plays a role in our 8 or 9 hour day at school. We have the bell system that tells us when to get to class and when to sit down and when to leave class. Every classroom has a clock in it. We all have phones or watches that tell us on a second by second basis what time of day it is. And that seems very, normal for us today, until you think about a life or a world that did not have this micromanagement of the day. So before the market revolution, clocks were really not a thing. The first clock in America is going to be brought into this small town in the early 1800s. And it's really going to be this huge event of like, wow, we have a bell tower with a clock on it. But think about why people really didn't need to know what time it was. Before the market revolution, most people are working where? They're working in small farms. What do they need to know? Well, their day starts when it's what? When it's light out. It's time to eat when they're hungry. Midday about. Workday ends when it's dark or when your task is done. How do you know what to grow? Well, it's based on seasons. Your year revolves around the growing season. So this is a much more kind of less specific way to view the world. With the clock, we get regimented by the hour. We see a change in how people are being paid. So instead of being paid based on how much you produce, like how much corn or how much cotton or soybean that you produce, it's how long did you work. Like I said, this first clock is going to be introduced in America in 1801, and people are going to be paid by the hour instead of by the product. That leaves people less connected with their finished product. If that young girl in her late teens at the Willow Factory mill in Massachusetts, she is less making an actual garment as maybe she would have in a sewing circle. She's just making one part of that garment, or she's tending a machine that will eventually make this garment. If you're a craftsman and you're building a table, you may not be making this entire table. You may just be making one part of this table. So your self-worth is changed. You don't see a value in your skill as much, which is kind of a disconnected way to think about this, but the effects that this have are huge. And people are really going to be kind of stressed out about this change. Stressed out about the change in their work, that they're less connected to the materials or the products that they're making. That they are going to have increasingly gender divisions in their labor. They're not going to be working with their spouse or their children on a farm. It's not, or in a sewing circle with other community members, or in a crafts workshop with other laborers. Even though they'll be in a big factory, it will be it'll be more isolated. And ultimately there's what comes out of this is a feeling of manipulation, of feeling like I'm not worth what I used to be. And with this comes really kind of the first unions. Very quickly, people are going to be very frustrated with this new style of work. Commonwealth v. Hunt will be really the first labor rights that workers earn. They'll have the right to unionize. This is very basic. It's not going to be very protective at all. We'll talk more about labor unions in the next unit. But this is the beginning steps here. We see how upset laborers are because as quickly they want to start unions and protecting their rights. Okay, so that's production. Let's talk about transportation, because that's the second leg of this objective here. America was growing, but it was also divided. If it's something that you learn from the era of good feelings, America is growing, but it's also really dividing in socially, politically, and economically. So industry is growing in the Northeast, which means that more resources are needed. If we have the Lowell textile mill in Massachusetts, up in the Northeast, they're taking cotton from the South. We need greater transportation in order to get that from, over that 1,000 miles or so, 800 miles. Now, Henry Clay, we're going to hear a lot from Henry Clay. He's going to come up with an idea during this era of good feelings called the American system. And his idea was to unite different regions of the country through a more effective transportation. It was this desire to propel the market revolution and to link all these different regions, the Northeast, the South, and the West, so agriculture and production could grow. Ultimately, Americans are going to be quite divided on this issue, surprisingly. Even though it seemed like a good idea, this required states to kind of get along and to agree on how this would go about. It also suggests a very strong central government, which people were wary about. And so it's ultimately going to fail. And so individual improvements are going to be left to the states to create. There won't be this unified system of transportation. So let's talk about some of these. The Cumberland Road is really going to be the first organized system of transportation. The advantage of this is it's linking major cities in the old Northwest, so the old Ohio River Valley, with manufacturing centers on the East Coast in the Northeast. This is going to be a toll road, so people will have to pay to get from one side to the other. The other downside is, what geographic feature is this road going over? The Appalachian Mountains. So think about trying to get over this road in the dead of winter. It's going to be difficult. It's not going to be a consistent or reliable mode of transportation. But it will be a start. And so even though it'll be rough going on over wagon wheels and dirt, bumpy roads, it will be our first link with natural resources in the West and manufacturing in the East. Erie Canal is going to be a game changer. This is going to be, people are going to be realizing that waterways are going to be incredibly effective for transporting heavy goods because of its ability to float. So the Erie Canal is going to be dug predominantly by Irish laborers, and it's going to be using water systems already in New York, but linking the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, which will go down to New York City, which again is one of the premier port cities in America. This is huge. This is going to allow agricultural products in the Ohio River Valley to get up to the Great Lakes, which then can be shipped down to New York. This is going to make New York City the premier port in the United States because of this Erie Canal. That was hand dug by hand by laborers. Incredibly difficult. So during this time, the Erie Canal is predominantly going to be a slow-moving canal. And as you can see, we don't even have steam powered yet. If you can look in this corner here, we see horses that are actually pulling these barges down and up down the stream, or down the canal, excuse me. Which brings us to our first major challenge of the Erie Canal, and canals like it. You can only go one way. We don't have steam powered yet. Conversely, these are going to be more difficult to traverse in the winter. Some aspects will be frozen over. So they are advantageous. They're better than the road, but they still have their downsides. Furthermore, I mean, if we go back to this last slide, what can a canal not do? A canal can't go over a mountain. It can't go up. So we've got to go really far around these mountain ranges and really be kind of restricted by the geography. However, the canals, this idea is going to be seen as much superior than roads. So we're going to see the really proliferation of canals throughout the Northeast, and again linking the West, the Ohio River Valley, the South, where agriculture is produced, that good fertile land in the Ohio River Valley, the large plantations in the South, with the Northeast, where manufacturing is made. By the 1840s, we're going to have the steam engine. And so that is going to allow much more traveling. Robert Fulton will be creating the steam engine and will be first applied to a boat, which will allow goods to be shipped faster through these canals and also up and down the canal. You can go both upstream and downstream. Now, with the steam engine will come new ideas for how to get goods places, and the next idea that people will be toying with is over land. Because again, the weaknesses of a canal is you can only travel during some parts of the season, some parts of the year. It's very limited on geography. You can't obviously go over mountains. So wanting to improve the roads with the steam engine, and we come up with these tracked cars, the railroad. And ultimately that will be a huge game changer. The railroad will be the transportation of the century. That will be how goods and people will travel. Canals will still be used, but railroads will be put on a fast track towards really growing throughout the United States. So we can see how quickly railroads are growing by the 1850s. And again, predominantly where? What two regions are really being linked? We see predominantly in the old Northwest, this Ohio River Valley, around Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati. This is where great agriculture is beginning. And linking that with the Northeast, where goods are produced, they're processed, where these major cities are, where the people are, as we'll find, are going to begin to populate. Exporting those goods to Europe. The last bit of transportation is a different idea, the telegraph. And I know we don't necessarily think of the telegraph as a traditional form of transportation, but it is. It's the transportation of ideas. And thinking about how important the transportation of ideas are for marketplaces. If you have a change in demand, rather than having to wait, potentially days or weeks to get that information about whether you need to increase your supply or you need to stop building things or producing things, time is money. And so being able to know in a moment's notice whether you need to send 50 more tons of cotton up to Lowell, Massachusetts, or if you need to change your production method, that is going to be a game changer for growing our production and being more efficient. Okay, so what are these effects? Going back to our essential question, we are going to create a national market economy. during this market revolution. That's why we call it a market revolution. We are linking the regions of the West, North, and South. And the effects of this are going to be staggering. Food prices and travel rates are going to lower in prices, which is a good thing for everybody. It's going to be more efficient. We're going to have more regional specialization. And this is kind of a double-edged sword. So on the one side, it is very productive that we begin to see one region doing one thing. It's very much kind of like the factory system on a macro scale. So where these regions are like different workers in a factory just doing one task. So the north is going to be with industry and trade. Because of these port cities, they're going to develop these banking systems where money is generated and kept. We're going to see greater immigration moving to these cities, as we'll learn next week. So that's going to be their thing. The South is going to be doubling down on cash crops. And by the 1890s or 1790s, it will be cotton. And that money is going to be increasingly tied up in their labor. There's going to be very little investment in anything else in the South. There's not going to be a lot of infrastructure. There's not going to be a lot of development. All their money with those plantations is tied up in their labor, which means they don't have a lot of money to be investing in other things. However, most of the population is going to be small-scale farming. So this is going to be a dichotomy that we'll examine when we get closer to the Civil War. And the West is going to be cattle, grain, and agriculture. A lot more land. So people, especially with that Jeffersonian mentality, are going to be wanting to move west in order to start a new life and get a plot of land so that they can contribute and have a family and have this Jeffersonian ideal. With that idea of the West and the purchase of Louisiana, we see the exploration of new territories. Under Jefferson, he ultimately made that decision to purchase Louisiana, the deal of the century, and after that sends Lewis and Clark expedition to find a route to the Pacific Ocean, to explore what is the advantages of this territory. What did we just buy, essentially? And what they find is just beyond anybody's wildest imagination. They go through, beginning at the Mississippi, essentially, finding the Rocky Mountains, finding the Great Plains, which will be, in the future, feeding the American population. The Rocky Mountains, which will be the source of water for most of the western hemisphere, or the western side of the continent. Moving all the way to the Pacific, which they'll realize is going to be a huge asset for trade, trading with other countries, increasingly, as we'll see, China. Sacagawea will be a instrumental help for this process. They would not have made it without her. And that's the other sad part of the story, is with this exploration, Lewis and Clark encounter the people who live in that area. The Sioux, the Blackhawks, the Cherokee, and that will be kind of our first encounters with the native population. And we will begin to go on the trajectory that we've been on since the very beginning, of wanting to expand more land and breaching conflicts with the natives that are living there. So with this, after Lewis and Clark come back, after we gain this kind of new idea of new possibilities in the West, even if it is just the West up to the Mississippi, we have this idea of rugged individualism, that people, under this Jeffersonian idea, that people have the power, they have the right to go and start a new life. It's based on individual freedoms, of opportunity, of eventually hard work. What they'll find is very necessary in order to survive in the West. And this idea that you can go and start a new life on your own is going to be a very attractive idea. There's going to be a whole group of artists and writers, with Emerson and Thoreau, the transcendental literature that really celebrates this idea of getting into nature to really explore oneself. Emerson was quoted for saying, "Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principle." So that people are very much in power of their destiny and their ability to connect with nature and to build their life and their happiness. As we'll find, this is a kind of a contradictory view. Yes, we have this idea of rugged individualism, but what we'll find in the growing West is that people are not doing this alone. It is a very difficult place to live. And when people are going out on their own and living in isolation, it's a very hard and painful existence. People are going crazy out in the middle of nowhere after not seeing individuals or any community members, for months on end. Women were in charge of keeping the house as men were going out and trading or hunting or gathering, whatever that be. And that existence that they had alone was incredibly painful. It was a hard thing to do. So what we find is that the birth of more community groups in this West. It's also really hard to build houses and to start communities. So we see the growth of people coming together to make this happen. As well as we'll find the federal government coming in and making sure that these places are livable and helping people to grow their new life. We'll talk more about these thinkers later in this unit. All right. Well, that will actually we'll call it for today. Thank you so much. Let's see. Next, we'll talk about the immigrants who are coming to these new cities during this market revolution. But until then, have a great day.